Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Audio Fanfics and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto fell into despair, and Hinata, Ino and Tenten refused to let him go, part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Hinata took a deep breath and straightened her cream-colored jacket before reaching forward and turning the door handle to the classroom's entrance. Once the door was open a crack, she apprehensively glanced inside, spotting Iruka sitting behind his desk as he tended to. Though she had planned to make her entrance deliberately, her instructor spotted her before she could withdraw her head from the room. "I'm glad you could make it, Hinata." He greeted her with a smile. The heiress' face flushed red at her discovery, but she managed to control her embarrassment enough to step through the door without much of a tremor in her step. Well. You did call for me to see you after class, sensei," she said in her usual, nervous tone. Iruka nodded and motioned for her to come to his desk, to which she obliged briskly. Once she was in front of his undersized base of operations, the instructor spoke once again. "I'm sorry to cut the pleasantries short, but I called you here for something fairly serious. Before I tell you what this is about, though, I have a question for you," he said. Hinata furrowed her brow. "I will answer as best I can, sensei," she assured him earnestly. The instructor folded his hands on the desk and looked her in the eyes intently. "What have you noticed about the class lately? In terms of differences, I mean?" he asked. Hinata opened her mouth to offer an instantaneous response, but caught herself to conduct herself more eloquently than she likely would have reflexively. "It has certainly been quieter the past few weeks, though I don't think that's necessarily a good thing," she said vaguely. Noticing that Iruka was still staring at her expectantly, Hinata's nerves flared up powerfully. And Naruto-kun hasn't been attending class lately. His seat has been empty," she blurted out, mentally kicking herself for letting the affectionate honorific slip. The instructor gave her a sympathetic look as her face burned bright red. "Everybody with eyes and ears knows, Hinata. You don't have to be secretive," he said as gently as he could. The heiress groaned and fought to control the heat in her face to no avail. "Am I really that obvious?" she asked quietly, earning a short nod from her teacher. Sensing her plummeting mood, Iruka reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. "But that's part of why I called you here, actually. So keep your head up. It all has to do with Naruto, and why he hasn't been here lately," he said. Hinata immediately snapped to attention, though her face was still tinted red. "Go on," she urged him eagerly. Iruka stifled a chuckle at her sudden attentiveness and renewed interest at the revelation of Naruto's involvement. "I'm going to be blunt with you, Hinata. I'm only going to you because I'm out of options. Naruto is not well. Mentally or physically. I don't know what caused it. I don't know why it started, but he's been spiraling over the past few weeks," he said directly. Hinata's demeanor shifted instantly, but not quite in the way Iruka had expected it to. Her meekness gave way to a look of steely concern and something resembling conviction. "Explain in detail. I want to know everything," she pressed without a single stutter. Though slightly taken aback by her sudden shift initially, Iruka nodded and took a deep breath. "A few weeks back, he just started to respond less. First, he started clamming up in class, which I took as a good sign until I realized he wasn't speaking a single word to anybody or even me. So, I decided to try to talk to him. He put on a grin and seemed like his normal self," he began, taking a moment to allow Hinata to process the first section of information before continuing on. "After that, I watched him a bit more carefully. He wasn't just quiet, he wasn't even paying attention. He's always talked about as a poor student, and he is to some extent, but he always used to at least try. He's just not an academic type. But he was just staring off into the wall when I watched him," he said with a bothered look as he revisited the memories. "And then he just stopped coming last week. So, I went to check on him at his apartment. What I found didn't really answer any questions, but it definitely gives some context. He was sleeping in the middle of the day. Completely out cold. I left without waking him, and when I came back the next day, it was the same story," he concluded. Hinata seemed to have been sobered a bit by the details of what was known about Naruto. "That sounds nothing like him. Nothing at all," she said quietly. A moment of silence then passed between them. How do I factor into this? I haven't spoken to him very much, so he may not be responsive to me if you're wanting me to try to get him to come back. Hinata asked skeptically. I don't want him to come back. Not right now. Whatever is up with him is more important than academics. I just want you to do daily check-ins to make sure he's actually in the apartment, and if he isn't, tell me so we can set time aside to search. I'll exempt you from the morning lesson as long as you do the check-ins. Uruka replied. The Hyuga girl began to fidget a bit. How will I do that, though? I can't exactly just barge in on him. That would be rude. She pointed out. Uruka briefly rummaged through a drawer in his desk before producing a key and tossing it to her. That's a spare of his room key. Use it at your own discretion. You don't need to do anything more than check on him, like I said. He said. Hinata stared at the key blankly, seemingly flabbergasted by the fact that she now had personal access to the blonde's apartment. Probably a dream come true for you, kid. Though, not under the circumstances you wanted. The instructor thought to himself with a mix of humor and sympathy. Why did you choose me for this task? There are better people for the job, I think. Hinata asked dejectedly. Uruka shook his head firmly. No, I don't think there are. Now, if you don't want to do this, then I understand. It's a fairly big commitment. He said. Hinata instantly shook her head and tightened her grip on the key. No, I'm more than willing. I just don't understand why I'm your choice. She clarified quickly. Uruka pursed his lips and exhaled through his nose. It's because I trust you to care enough to actually do it. You know as well as I do that Naruto is far from popular. Many of your classmates may even want to help him, but their parents would stop them from doing so. I considered Shikamaru, because the Nara have always been kind to him, but that's a shot in the dark. I know that you'll actually go the full 9 yards for him. He explained. The heiress shifted in place uncomfortably. Even if I want to do it, my clan has never thought much of him. I don't know how I'd explain it to father. She said uncertainly. Uruka leaned back in his chair and stretched a bit. Your father actually oversaw Naruto's cleaning of the Hokage monument after he vandalized it last year. I was busy, and Hokage-sama was out for foreign affairs. He said he found Naruto to be quite interesting, for whatever that's worth. He said, drawing a look of surprise from the Hyuga girl that quickly turned to one of something resembling relief. That's news to me, but I'm glad. I'll do all that I can. She said with a bow. Uruka smiled at her formality and briefly reviewed all that he had said to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Oh, and if he happens to be conscious when you check on him, tell him that I sent you. You know, just so he doesn't think that you're there to rob him. He added humorously. The Hyuga girl nodded politely and pocketed the spare key. Should I check on him tonight? She asked. Uruka stood up from his desk and walked around it. Before he could pass her entirely, he spoke. I'd appreciate it if you did, but I'd be sure you actually want to do that. There's a good chance he'll be awake if he's been sleeping all day like I think he has been. Now, I'm going to go take a walk. He advised her before exiting the classroom and leaving Hinata to herself. Once she was alone, the heiress took a deep breath and then released it. I've always wanted to reach out to you, but not under circumstances like these. You had better be okay, Naruto-kun. She muttered to herself as she gathered her nerves. At this, she swiftly exited the academy to make her way to the blonde's dwelling. Uruka rubbed the side of his aching head and sat down tiredly. Ramen had never been a particular favorite of his generally speaking, but the stand itself was quite a nice place to be when one needed space. It did good business, more than enough to stay afloat, but there were lulls. At present, it was in the midst of one of them. You look bothered, Uruka-san. Tuki, the owner of the stand, said as he slid him a glass of water. The instructor gladly accepted the drink and downed half of it before responding to the man's words. Your number one customer isn't exactly doing well, so I think I have the right to be a bit down right now, he replied. The older man gave a knowing nod and leaned his weight on his side of the counter. He hasn't been stopping by as often. I figured something was afoot. To be frank, he's looked very blank all the times I've seen him walking lately. he said thoughtfully. Uruka drummed his fingers on the counter and considered all that he knew. Depression isn't uncommon in a kid his age, and he's got more reason to be depressed than just about anybody, but that's just never been who he is. Not to my knowledge, at least. He pondered. Chuki poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher sitting to his left. As well as I'd like to think we know him, things are always different behind closed doors. He's likely always struggled more than he lets on. Maybe he's just finally been pushed to the point where he can't hide it anymore, he suggested with a twinge of sadness in his voice. Uruka took a sip from his glass. There's probably some truth to that, honestly. I've always done my best to be his friend and treat him fairly. I've never been one to let him get away with things he shouldn't be doing, but I've never punished him all that harshly. Hokage-sama takes care of that sort of thing when it's necessary, he said. Chuki gave him a smile. Naruto doesn't speak kindly of many people, but you're one of the few that he does. You've done a fine job, Uruka-san, he assured the instructor kindly. I'm glad. He's a good kid. Definitely not for everybody, but he deserves so much better than what he deals with. At least I know that he can see that a few people care. Uruka said through a sigh. The stand owner then posed a question. So, what do you plan to do? I'm guessing that you've already made sure he's safe already, he inquired. The younger man remained quiet initially. I'm taking a risk and assigning Hinata Hyuga to do daily check-ins. For the first day or two, she'll just be making sure he's either in his apartment or at school. Past that, I may start having her drop assignments off at his door. It all depends on how long this all lasts, he said after a time. Chuki raised an eyebrow and finished the last of his water, which he had slowly been draining. A Hyuga? That does sound risky. They aren't exactly known for their warmness, he said jokingly. To his surprise, Uruka shook his head and looked on thoughtfully. No, that's not the issue. Hinata is a very sweet girl, and she has a major crush on Naruto. I'm not worried about her not treating him well if they end up interacting directly. What I'm worried about is how Naruto reacts to her, he clarified. The stand owner grinned. Well, at least I know that his generation has some taste, then. When you say that you're worried about how he'll react to her, do you mean that he may not be pleasant toward her? He asked quizzically. Something like that, but not for the reasons you may be thinking. Naruto isn't exactly used to people doing things for him. He gets suspicious when they try. Hinata tried to give him a card and some candy on Valentine's Day last year, and he just stared right through her. The poor girl literally fainted. I'm worried that might happen again, among other things. Uruka explained. Chuki laughed a bit. That sounds like something he'd do. You may as well tell me the other reasons. Nighttime rush hour doesn't start for another 45 minutes. We have time, he urged the instructor. Though he initially hesitated, Uruka obliged. The biggest thing is that I'm worried about Hinata getting too invested in this. When I say that she likes him, I don't mean in the way most girls like a boy at this age. I found out about her interest in him by accident when I saw her open notebook. It was full of poetry about him. Really touching stuff. None of it was about his looks or anything like that. Just about him as a person. He began, sifting carefully through the memory. She always stares at him during class, but not in that usual starstruck way most schoolgirls do when they're looking at the man of the month. No, she just smiles. It's the only time she does. She's also the only person in the room who actually laughs at his jokes. It's really quite touching to watch, he continued. Chuki stroked his chin. It sounds to me like you're concerned that she may come to realize just how much he hides just below the surface. I haven't seen as much of it as you have, but Naruto is far from one-dimensional. He's quite self-aware, he interjected. Uruka shifted in his seat. Part of me thinks she knows that, but I also don't think she could possibly understand the depth of it even if she does. I guess we'll have to wait and see. She's the only person in that class one trusts to be gentle about it, so it's my best option, he said. Chuki shrugged his shoulders and began to prepare ramen for the oncoming rush of customers. Let's just hope that it isn't too severe. Now what flavor do you want? It's on the house. Hinata took several deep breaths as she inserted the spare key into the door of Naruto's apartment. She had not needed directions to find his home, as she had passively noticed which building he always entered quite some time ago. From there, it was just a matter of asking the receptionist which room number belonged to him. The woman behind the desk had looked more than a bit surprised by the question, but had given Hinata the information without complaint. It's just a door. Turn the knob and open it. If he's awake, then you say what you rehearsed on the way here. If he's sleeping, then you inspect the apartment and make sure he isn't living in a trash can. It's all very simple. She coached herself as she slowly turned the handle. Gradually and carefully, she pushed the door open. Much to her relief, she was met with an empty room. The lights were off, but there was just enough illumination to make out the contents of the space. Deciding to not risk a panic, Hinata simply allowed her dojutsu to manifest itself in her eyes to solve the visibility issues. With her Byakugan active, the heiress learned two things. Firstly, Naruto was in his bedroom, and appeared to be asleep. Second, the room was an absolute mess. I figured that he would be a touch messy, but this is extreme, the heiress thought to herself. Shelving the thought for the time being, Hinata went to work cleaning up. It wasn't particularly hard work, but it was tedious. Despite her general dislike of the task she was performing, Hinata found solace in the fact that she was doing Naruto a service. One that it seemed he badly needed. The apartment itself was set up fairly logically. There was a couch and two chairs off to the left in an open space, and a half kitchen on the right. There was also a hallway that began on the farthest wall and went on for roughly 10 feet into it. Within the hall were two rooms, which Hinata had determined to be his bedroom and bathroom. Once she had finished cleaning up the room as quietly as she could, she moved on to the kitchen. For one reason or another, Hinata felt compelled to check the fridge. Taking hold of the handle firmly, the heiress pulled it open and peered inside. The first thing that struck her was the smell of expired milk, to which she recoiled and pinched her nose. Why would he keep it so far past its expiration date? She wondered silently as she removed the bad carton from the unit and deposited it into the garbage. Upon further inspection, she found that the milk had been the only other contents of the fridge other than two small bottles of water. Shaking her head in confusion, Hinata then began to reach up to open one of his cupboards. Before she could do so, the lights switched on. The heiress immediately tensed and felt her heart rate increase tenfold in pace. Slowly turning her head to face what she had already seen with her heightened field of vision, Hinata fought valiantly to control the heat in her face to no avail. Standing just outside of the far hall with his hand on the light switch was Naruto. Don't faint. Do not faint, Hinata Hyuga. She urged herself, her nerves buzzing with embarrassment at having been discovered so unceremoniously. Naruto-kun, can explain. She stammered meekly. The blonde raised an eyebrow and scratched the side of his face absently. I'm sure you can, he said calmly. He then lapsed into silence, a clear cue for the Hyuga girl to begin her explanation of why she was in his home, rummaging through his kitchen. Iruka-sensei sent me. He wanted to make sure you were okay, she said nervously. Naruto's expression remained apathetic and blank. He gave no verbal response. Instead, he began a steady walk toward Hinata. Tightening up even more so than before, the heiress braced for some kind of verbal reprimand as the blonde boy drew closer. It never came. Perplexingly, he simply walked right past her and closed the fridge. He then glanced up at her hand, which was still on the handle of his cupboard. I figured he'd get sick of checking on me eventually, but I didn't think he'd start telling people to steal my food. That's just. He mumbled. Hinata immediately shook her head. No, I'm not here to steal from you, Naruto-kun. I was checking to see if why you were stalked, she said quickly. His gaze then shifted from the cupboard to her face, causing them to make eye contact for the first time. It was then that Hinata's confusion morphed into genuine concern. His normally lively face was sullen, and his cheeks were gaunt. Even his eyes seemed duller than usual. Something was off. Your family's rich as hell, so yeah. That makes sense. As you can see, I'm fine. You can leave now, Naruto said bluntly. Hinata felt a pang of hurt from his flat remark, but to her own surprise, she stood her ground. Why haven't you been coming to class? She blurted out. Her classmate remained silent for a number of moments before shrugging his shoulders and turning his back to her. It shouldn't matter. It's nothing important. I'll be back. Probably. He said vaguely. The heiress looked on in puzzled confusion and took steps to follow him. It does matter. Why your grades will drop if why you skip class. That would be, she began. She was unable to finish her sentence, however, due to Naruto turning around to face her again. My grades have always been garbage. Nice try, but that's not a good reason. It's not like class is any worse with me gone. You guys can actually focus now. He cut in. Hinata opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when she felt that her words would be beyond jumbled. Taking her silence as resignation, the blonde walked back down the hall and entered his bedroom. I want you to come back, Naruto-kun, she said quietly once he was gone, finding that she was now shaking slightly. She then heard the lock turn on the bedroom door. Easily deducing his silent message, Hinata hung her head and turned to leave. Before she did so, however, she returned to the cupboard and opened it. What she found was confusing. It was fully stocked with instant ramen and small cans of food, all of which were completely untouched and unopened. The bell for lunch rang in its shrill tone as the clock struck noon. As it reverberated through the academy, the students breathed a collective sigh of relief. Lessons had been tediously dull, and they had all worked up an appetite through sheer boredom. Within moments, all but a handful of genin to be had exited the main classroom to enjoy their lunches outdoors at the picnic tables. In the end, all that remained was Hinata and a few other students scattered throughout the room. Naruto had not returned, though Hinata was hardly surprised, having spoken to him briefly the night prior. In general, the encounter had been a strange one, and not in a particularly good sense. Naruto had been incredibly volatile in ways that concerned the Hyuga girl on several levels. His demeanor could have best been described as an odd mix of perturbed and dismissive. It was the second of these distinctions that bothered Hinata. I understand why he was irritated. I entered his home unannounced, and I'm more or less a stranger to him right now. He had every right to question my arrival, but he was just so negative. She reviewed as she opened her bento and carefully removed a rice ball. The heiress was no stranger to Naruto's suppressed anguish. She had seen him collapse and cry in the training field more than once. The difference then as opposed to the present was that those breakdowns were an aberration. Naruto was, by all accounts and according to all available evidence, a positive person. He was always the person to see the brighter side, even when his classmates would mock him for his often outlandish solutions. Optimism was a feature of him, not an occasion. Pessimism, on the other hand, very much was an occasion. In fact, the only thing he tended to speak poorly of with any consistency was Sasuke Uchiha, and Hinata had long suspected that he held Sasuke in high regard underneath the bravado. At his apartment, the blonde's entire person was starkly different from what Hinata was used to seeing. One thing he had said in particular had continued to bother the heiress all through the night, on which she got very little sleep. It's not like class is any worse with me gone. You guys can actually focus now. In and of itself, the statement radiated self-loathing. It was an expression of awareness of just how much his presence was maligned by those around him. If that was the root of his negativity, then there were other questions to be asked regarding how good an idea it was for him to come back to the academy in the immediate future. Though, there seemed to be something else as well. It wasn't just irritation I felt in him. He seemed very tired. Nearly spent, frankly. Hinata recalled, taking a bite of her rice as she mulled over the encounter within her mind. Something then caught her ear. It was the voices of two students. He's still not back yet. The first student, a girl, asked her classmate, who nodded and leaned back in his seat and stretched. Yeah, still gone. Savor it while you can. He'll be back at some point. He joked, earning a slight laugh from the girl, who took a sip from her bottle of water. Let's hope it takes a while, she said before the conversation shifted to other topics. As she listened in on the brief exchange, Hinata felt her blood boil. It took a great deal of willpower to prevent herself from standing up and making her uncensored opinion of them known. The heiress had long since grown used to hearing Naruto be slandered behind his back, but now, with his mental and physical well-being called into question, she found it to be utterly unbearable. How are you all so cold? A boy drops off the face of the earth for 2 weeks, and all you can think about is how glad you are that he's gone. She mentally hissed. Her hands were curled into fists, and her jaw was clenched. Hinata was not a bellicose person. She was hardly ever aggressive or indignant enough to struggle to control herself, but she was well and truly angered by this point. I need to calm down. Lashing out won't help anything. They've always been blind, she thought to herself as a measure to quell her flaring temper. To distract herself, she returned her thoughts to the final thing she had seen before exiting Naruto's apartment the previous night. Why was the food untouched? I swear I even saw some dust on it. And if his fridge was any indication, he doesn't have anything else, she pondered. It was a pertinent question to ask, because its answer had potentially distressing implications. Hinata shook her head and closed her bento as she finished the last of her food. I need to see him more. I can't jump to conclusions just yet. I'll visit him again tonight. He was asleep this morning from what my eyes showed me, so I think it would be justifiable to check again, she reasoned. She then glanced up at the clock, which read 10 past noon. She still had 20 minutes of lunch left. Opting to do something other than stew over negatives, the heiress reached down under her desk and produced her notebook as well as a pencil. It's been a bit since I did this, she thought to herself as she began to draw on a blank page. For the next several minutes, she silently sketched with a light smile on her face. She had little time for hobbies given her schedule, but artistry had always appealed to her when she had the chance. This turned out quite well. I may frame it, she thought proudly as she beheld the completed drawing. She then noticed one missing detail. I forgot the whisker markings. My favorite part of him, too, she realized, adding the simple markings as the clock neared 18 minutes past noon. With the picture now truly complete, Hinata sighed and gazed at the likeness of Naruto that she had sketched. How other girls don't find you handsome is beyond me. Call me selfish, but it is nice to be without competition sometimes, she thought with a low chuckle. Another sigh. Though, it's not as though I've made any progress with you in the past few years. I guess being assigned to check in on you could help me, she thought dejectedly. It was one of her primary sources of frustration, that being her inability to properly approach the blonde. Before his most recent rut, he had always been friendly and open to people willing to be the same toward him. Despite that, the Hyuga girl's social awkwardness tended to massively increase in his presence. She wasn't even particularly sure why it was that she struggled to calm down around him. Save for the incident on Valentine's Day the prior year, he had never given her any negative feedback on the rare occasions that she found herself in a conversation with him. He looked genuinely confused when I tried to give him that card. It probably didn't help that I passed out when he stared at me like that, she thought shamefully. Fainting had been a consistent issue throughout her life when under duress, though it had improved significantly over time. For all that she was uncertain of regarding Naruto at present, she was set on one thing: she could not afford to faint around him again. If he's having self-esteem issues, which I think he always has, then me dropping dead in front of him will do nothing but hurt him, she thought to herself firmly. In the midst of her mental review of what she could and could not do from then on out, the bell rang to signify the end of lunch. Soon enough, the room was filled with students once again, prompting Hinata to hide away her notebook and straighten her posture. You may not like being checked on, Naruto-kun, but you're seeing me again tonight. Naruto rubbed his eyes tiredly as he put on his nightshirt and pajama pants. He had spent much of his day in bed, be it over or under the covers, but there was a point at which he could no longer stand the feeling of a stale set of clothing. It was nearly 8 o'clock, and it was high time to actually sleep. Despite spending most of his time on the mattress, he slept little throughout the day. It wasn't as though he didn't try to sleep. That was what most of his time had been dedicated to. Time passed at a painfully sluggish pace when he was conscious, and it only accentuated just how bleak his current state was. Sleep was the release that allowed him to wake up feeling something resembling refreshed. Sleep was good. Sleep was his drug. Should probably drink something. I haven't done that yet today, he thought to himself wearily. Cracking his stiff joints several times, the blonde exited his bedroom and made the short trek to the fridge. He then listlessly opened the door and grabbed one of his 2 remaining bottles of water. Man, I really need to go buy more. Anything but the tap water, he muttered to himself. Turning to return to his bed, the solitary academy student squinted his eyes to better adjust them to the dark. However, he was stopped in his tracks by the sound of his door opening. Naruto heaved a heavy sigh and turned on his heel to face the entrance to his dwelling. You again? He asked tiredly as he beheld Hinata Hyuga peering in at him from the outer hallway. She looked classically nervous, and her hands were fidgeting down by her waist. Naruto seldom interacted with the shy girl, but he had always appreciated her cordiality. She was never an antagonist, unlike the vast majority of his other classmates. Overall, he was less irritated by her presence being assigned to him by Iruka than he would have been for others, though he still disliked it. As I said yesterday, Iruka-sensei assigned me to check on you. So I'm doing it, Hinata said quietly. Naruto studied her carefully as she entered his apartment with small, deliberate steps. He sensed no ill intent from her, but he still found her loyalty to the job given to her strange. Well, I'm here, and I'm fine. I think your job's done, Hinata, he said shortly as they stared at one another through the darkness of the unlit room. The heiress shook her head and took another step forward, much to the blonde's surprise given what he knew of her nature. No, I disagree. I'm also here to make sure you're feeling alright, and I don't think just taking a look at you is enough to know that for sure, she said firmly. Naruto raised an eyebrow and screwed the cap off of his water bottle. I mean, I'm right in front of you, I'm on my feet, and I'm talking to you. What more do you need? He asked skeptically. The heiress stayed quiet for a moment before unclasping her hands and letting them dangle at her sides. Let's talk a little longer. Tell me how you've been. Tell me why you aren't coming to school. Convince me that you're okay, she challenged. Naruto took a step back. Of all the things he had expected to come of Hinata's apparently routine visits, being called to the carpet by her had not been one of them. I'm tired. I don't really feel like talking. Besides, you don't know me very well. Why should I spill my guts to you? He countered. Hinata walked to her left and sat herself down at the kitchen table. It was a silent invitation. Naruto's face twitched slightly at her gall. What if I just walk back into my bedroom and lock the door? What then? He questioned. Hinata still looked quite uneasy, but her steady gaze had not wavered. I can't stop you from doing that, but I'd really prefer it if you didn't, she said meekly. Her words hardly held the confidence of her actions, but as it was said, the latter spoke more loudly than the former. Deciding to concede for the sake of having nothing better to do, Naruto sat down across from the girl and leaned his cheek on his hand. I just don't feel like showing up. Why would I? My grades are terrible, and getting laughed at all day kinda sucks. Happy now, he said bluntly. Hinata seemed to recoil a bit at his words, but she maintained eye contact with him. And no, I'm not. It doesn't make me happy to hear that. I also don't think you're telling me everything, she said. Naruto tapped his foot on the floor pensively. Even Iruka hadn't pressed him for details quite so relentlessly. I don't have to tell you everything. It's not even like there's much to say. I told you why. You don't just get to barge in here and start digging for every little detail of how I'm feeling. He snapped back defensively. Hinata flinched at his harshness. And while we're on that, how the hell are you even getting in here? My door is always locked, he asked suspiciously. The heiress started fidgeting once more, but soon gave him an answer in the form of fumbling for something in her pocket. Iruka-sensei gave it to me, she said softly as she presented a spare key to his apartment. Naruto furrowed his brow in confusion, as he had no recollection of having given his instructor anything of the sort. I don't even know where he got that. How about you hand that over? I don't really like other people being able to come in whenever they want, he said as he reached across the table to retrieve it. In another act of surprising fortitude, Hinata pulled the key out of his reach and pocketed it again. No, I'll be keeping it. Even if we aren't done talking, it's clear to me that you aren't okay. Until you are, I'm not giving it back, she said. The blonde clenched his teeth. What the hell do you even care for? You never talk to me, we don't have anything in common, and I'm not all that sure you aren't just doing this to look good. What did Iruka-sensei promise you, huh? A perfect score on the next test. He hissed in a tone. Apparently, the last accusation had been a bridge too far, because Hinata instantly shot to her feet. Shut up. Don't make assumptions. I'm here because I care about you. I'm not some selfish poser who's helping you to have a nice mark on my transcript, and don't you dare accuse me of being one. She practically yelled, her Byakugan having involuntarily flared to life in the midst of her indignation. Naruto stared at her with wide eyes. Before he could respond, Hinata turned her back to him and trudged over to the door, where she had left her bag upon her arrival. For a number of moments, she rummaged through it before producing something. She then returned to the table and dropped a bento in front of him. I noticed that your food in the cupboard was untouched, which makes me think you're neglecting to feed yourself. Eat that. It's better than any of the stale noodles you have. I made it for you, she said, her voice still containing plenty of irritation and even an undertone of pain. Her stutter had also entirely vanished. And since neither of us are really stable enough to talk sensibly, I'll leave you alone for tonight. I will be back tomorrow, whether you like it or not. Oh, and you're going to eat that. I'll check to make sure you did when I come back, she said before throwing up the hood of her cream jacket and exiting the apartment with her bag slung over her shoulder. As he watched her leave, Naruto released the breath he had been holding. What the hell is her problem? He grumbled as he stared down at the bento. Despite his words, he couldn't control the underlying feeling of regret he felt for having been so harsh. Shaking his head, the blonde opened the small box and peered inside, at which point his eyes widened. There's no way she made these. Hinata flopped down onto her bed raggedly and buried her face in her pillow. It had taken every shred of her self-control not to break down into tears on her trek back to the Hyuga estate. At a baseline, she had used a tremendous amount of energy both controlling her stutter and pushing herself to make Naruto talk. Being bold was not in her nature, and faking it was taxing. She had meant every word, but the manner in which they were presented was falsely confident in the extreme. Then, for her trouble, she had been accused of using him for her own gain. It hurt her immensely, both because of what it meant to her, and what it said about Naruto's view of himself. Hot tears soaked into the case on her pillow as she fought against the sobs threatening to make themselves audible. Why can't you see? Why can't you see that I'm not out to hurt you? What did I do wrong? She silently lamented. She could sense his turmoil the moment she had pressed him into a conversation. He was struggling with more than just a dislike of his classmates and schoolwork. There was more to it than that, and his reaction to Hinata's words had been indicative of that. Still, despite her new perspective on it all, Hinata did not have an answer. Have they really convinced you that you aren't worth helping? She pondered sadly as she flipped over to face the ceiling with still wet eyes. She knew in the back of her mind that Naruto's harsh remarks were likely not directed at her personally, but they had hurt nonetheless. I'm not giving up, you foolish boy. Just because you snap at me doesn't mean that I don't still feel the way I do. You're stuck with me. I'm coming back. I'm pushing my curfew as long as I have to, she thought to herself while wiping her eyes. A knock then came at her door. Not right now, please, she called out to the mystery person on the other side. After a brief pause, the person spoke. I simply wanted to congratulate you on your quarterly report card. We can discuss it later, came her father's voice. He then began to walk away, as evidenced by the sound of his slowly dissipating footsteps. Once he was out of range, Hinata reached down into her bag that sat on the floor by her bed and pulled out her notebook. She then turned on her bedside lamp and flipped through the pages until she reached her most recent sketch of Naruto. I'll make you smile like you were in this picture again. I swear it, Naruto-kun. Iruka frowned as he browsed over the bread aisle of the local grocery store. He was seeking a specific type of bread, and for the first time in a number of months, it seemed that it was out of stock. It was disappointing, but not overly distressing as a whole. The Chunin was far from a picky eater, though he did have his preferred products as most people did. Fine, I'll get the wheat kind instead. I guess I'm living on something other than sandwiches this month, he conceded as he plucked his distant second choice. The other product he had come to the market to buy was simple bottles of water. They were overpriced, even more so than the other already expensive products in the store. It was a hassle financially, but it was a part of life in the hidden leaf. As he headed toward the upper left corner of the store, where he knew the water to be, he caught sight of something as he approached. Standing in front of a box of water bottles, likely pondering just how capable he actually was of paying for them, was Naruto. It was the first time in weeks that Iruka had seen the boy outside of his apartment. For a moment, he stood silently 20 feet behind the boy, feeling as though any sudden movement could scare him away like a hunted animal. Eventually, Iruka shook off his nerves and made his way up to the boy from behind and tapped him on the shoulder. Look who finally dragged himself out of his cave. He greeted the blonde, who flinched and whirled around. At the sight of his teacher, Naruto seemed to relax just a tad. Oh, it's you. He muttered before turning back to the water box and picking out 5 bottles to try to carry in his arms. The instructor looked on humorously as he struggled to balance the bottles properly. Let me take a few of those. You're going to drop them a dozen times before you make it to the register, he offered. Naruto sighed and handed him 2 of the 5 bottles. They then briskly made their way to the cashier, who gave the blonde a predictably harsh look before begrudgingly charging him the normal price. Yeah, and you're only being fair because I've reported you for being a bigot before. Iruka thought to himself while staring at the cashier intently. Once the payment was done, they exited the store. Thanks for that, Naruto said before taking the 2 bottles he had given Iruka and tossing them into the plastic bag he had taken on the way out of the market. He then began to walk away, prompting the instructor to jog to catch up with him. Hey, talk to me, kid. How've you been? He said once he had made his way to an even pace with the academy student. Naruto shrugged his shoulders and shifted his grip on the bag. Ask Hinata. That's what she's for, right? He said shortly. Iruka winced at his tone. He was clearly not enthused by the heiress having been assigned to him. That's not exactly it. Look, I know why you're irritated, but you have to understand, I can't just sit back and let you isolate yourself. If I had the time, I'd be the one checking in on you, not her, he explained. Naruto scratched the side of his face absently. Why'd you even choose her? We don't really know each other, and all she does is stutter and try to make me talk about how I'm feeling. She's only been over twice, and I'm already sick of it, he replied. The instructor shook his head. Because my only other option was Shikamaru, and we both know he really couldn't care less. Hinata does care about you. She's just not very good at showing it, he said a tad awkwardly. Naruto stopped walking and turned to face the older man. What does that even mean? She's been talking like she knows a lot more about me than she does. She acts like she understands me. She doesn't know anything, he questioned. Iruka pursed his lips and exhaled through his nose. She actually does understand you a bit, though I can't really say why. It's not my place. Just know that she's doing her best. Try not to be too hard on her, Naruto. She's really putting herself out there, and she's ridiculously shy to begin with, he said. Naruto snorted. Are you sure she's shy? She basically screamed at me last night, he said, drawing a look of genuine surprise from his teacher. Wait, really? What did she say? He asked skeptically. The blonde began to respond, but quickly paused to consider something. It's not important. I just don't think she's all that shy, he said quietly. Iruka made a mental note of his reaction and stayed in place as Naruto began to walk away toward his apartment. The instructor slid his hands into his pockets and glanced in the direction of the Hyuga estate. So, things got emotional right away, it sounds like. That's sort of what I was afraid of. Maybe I should pull her out of this, he thought to himself. A brief review of the idea killed it quickly, however. No, I need to let them interact more. If he somehow brought a backbone out of her, he must have said something first. She wouldn't yell without prompting. Besides, even if I tried to stop her, I'm guessing that she'd keep on doing it, he mentally corrected himself. Hinata's demeanor during class was more or less unchanged, but he routinely caught her staring longingly at Naruto's empty desk. There was little to be done except to wait and see how things would end up shaking out. There were any number of outcomes, and all of them were impossible to predict. For the first time in a very long time, Naruto was very much an unknown commodity. Even during his brief encounter with the boy only minutes ago, Iruka had drawn practically nothing out of him aside from his distaste for Hinata's intrusion into his life. His tone tells me that he actually isn't as pessimistic about it as he's letting on. He definitely doesn't like it, but he doesn't hate it either, I don't think. Iruka thought to himself. Naruto Uzumaki being an emotional riddle would have come as a shock to Iruka a number of years ago, but not anymore. One only needed to watch him undetected for a week or two to understand that his feelings regarding himself and the world around him were quite complex. He had simply never expected Naruto to be overwhelmed by negativity as he seemed to be at present. It very much went against the norm. The blonde had experienced short stints of melancholy before, usually on or around the date of his birth, but they hardly ever lasted more than a few days. He had long searched for an answer as to why it had happened. It was a strenuous mental exercise. I know that the bullying bothers him, but he's always taken it with a grain of salt. Could it be that he thought, his mind trailing off as he considered perhaps the most brutal possibility. He quickly shook his head and began walking to his home on the other side of the village. No, it couldn't be. It's too early. It can't have weakened enough. He concluded to quell his gradually rising unease. Despite having assured himself of its impossibility, the notion he had hit upon still loomed large in his subconscious. In truth, he could only hope to be wrong. Hinata took a deep breath as she prepared to enter the lobby of Naruto's apartment building for the third night in a row. She was both apprehensive about, and very much looking forward to performing her nightly visit once again. Much of her apprehension lay in the truth that she did not know how the blonde felt about their somewhat loud exchange of words the previous night. Based upon her extensive observation of him throughout the years, she was fairly sure that he would be willing to move past it, but as he was now, those observations were very much called into question. I just hope he ate the rice balls. His face is too hollow for my liking, and he needs to eat, she thought to herself, pushing open the door to the complex as she did so. When she stepped inside, she was met with a surprising sight. Naruto was in the lobby, standing no more than 2 feet in front of her. The lobby's lights tended to shut off past 8 o'clock, and it was presently 9, which had obstructed the Hyuga girl's view through the glass. I was about to go for a walk, Naruto said as an opener, his tone clearly somewhat uncomfortable. Hinata stepped back and out into the street again so as not to invade his personal space. Oh, I see. Well, in that case, I'll walk with you, she replied with her eyes on the ground. The blonde responded by shrugging his shoulders and walking right past her. Hinata immediately followed him and fell into step with him. The blonde made no effort to hide his sigh of resignation as the heiress walked alongside him. I'm not going anywhere interesting. You're wasting your time, he grumbled. Hinata simply ignored him and continued to keep pace with him. For a time, they walked in silence. Eventually, it was the far quieter of the two who broke the wordless void. Were you taking a walk to avoid me? She asked. The blonde gave her a sideways glance and then returned his gaze to the street ahead. You've got freaky eyes that can see through walls, so no. You'd have just tracked me down anyway, he said. Hinata reddened a tad at his description of her eyes as freaky. I can't help that I have the Byakugan, you know, she replied quietly. Naruto seemed to sober a bit upon noticing her obvious embarrassment. You're right. Sorry for saying that, he murmured softly. Slightly taken aback by his sudden apologetic sentiments, the Hyuga girl smiled and shook her head. No need to apologize. It was a stray comment. Nothing more, she assured him kindly. The silence then returned to cast itself over the pair. You're still in there. I can feel you, Naruto-kun, she thought to herself as she tried her best to subtly gaze at him without being overzealous. Eventually, after nearly 10 full minutes of walking, Naruto stopped in his tracks and stretched. They had stopped near a bench that looked out over a training field. The blonde promptly took a seat and rubbed his eyes. Suddenly feeling quite uneasy, Hinata simply stared down at her now seated classmate. May I sit down as well? She asked nervously. Naruto glanced back up at her and shrugged his shoulders for the second time that night. Suit yourself, I guess, he said blankly. Relaxing a tad, the heiress carefully sat down on the bench while maintaining the space between them. Within herself, she very much wished to sit quite close to him, but knew better than to try. Instead of dwelling on her own desires, she posed a question. Tell me truthfully, did you eat the food I made you, and Naruto-kun? She asked. Naruto kept his eyes fixed on the field ahead of him and gave a short nod. Yeah, I did, he responded absently. Hinata's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't entirely certain he was lying, but she was also unsure if he was being truthful. Swallowing the growing lump in her throat, Hinata scooted toward him several inches and reached out with her left hand, which she rested on his neck. The blonde instantly recoiled. What the hell are you doing? He demanded tensely. Hinata met his eyes reluctantly and forced a look of steadiness onto her face. Say it again. Tell me why you ate it again. I want to be as sure you're telling me the truth. She half requested, half ordered him as her middle and index fingers lightly pressed down on one of his neck's pulsating arteries. Her classmate looked more than a bit uncomfortable, but seemed to realize quickly that he would be better off doing as he was told. I ate the rice you gave me. I promise. He said. Finding that his pulse had not increased notably in a way that suggested dishonesty, Hinata removed her hand from his neck and folded it with her other in her lap. Forgive me for being so bold, but I wanted to make sure, she said shyly. Naruto drummed his fingers on his own thigh for a moment. You're acting so different than you did in school. You were a wallflower. Why are you being so pushy now? He asked. Despite the wording of the question, his tone held no malice. Hinata had expected the question at some point, but it had come far too soon for her to not immediately become tongue-tied upon hearing it voiced. I really don't think I can answer that gracefully right now, she said honestly. The blonde gave her a skeptical look and studied her. I don't understand you at all, he said simply before leaning back and stretching a bit. The only sound present was the softly rustling grass and the occasional shifting of Hinata's feet on the ground. It's because why your safety is important to me, and you aren't as safe right now. For that reason, I'll be as harsh as I need to be to keep you as safe. Even if that means challenging you sometimes, the heiress practically whispered. Her tone was hushed, but Naruto still caught most of it loud and clear. His reaction was odd, to say the least. Instead of snapping back at her, the blonde stood to his feet and stepped in front of the still-seated girl. For a time, he simply stared down at her with an indecipherable expression plastered on his face. The silence was unbearable on Hinata's end. Fortunately for her, it lasted less than a minute. I don't get why that matters to you, but I guess there's no point in getting mad at you for it like I did last night. But if I were you, I'd back out now. You don't want to be around me. Trust me, I'm not worth your time, he said evenly. Hinata's expression contorted into one of pained confusion. Who put those lies into your mind? Who convinced you that you're so troublesome? She asked. The blonde gave a derisive chuckle. Everybody. Literally everybody. I didn't get why until recently, but I understand now. Knowing sucks, but I'm glad I do now. It made a few things fall into place for me. The way you treat me tells me that you don't know, unlike the rest, he said vaguely. Hinata surprised even herself by rising to meet him. It would take something unforgivable. You may not think I know you, but I do. Better than you'd be comfortable knowing, she said strongly. Naruto, in a reversal of their dynamic up to that point, averted his eyes from hers. I still don't believe that. We've hardly ever talked, he pointed out. At this, Hinata's face fell a tad and her posture deflated slightly. I know that. And I wish I could express how sorry I am for sitting idly by while the others picked on you, she said quietly. Naruto finally returned his eyes to her. Well, it's too late now. It all got to me before you could, he said with a simplicity that shook Hinata to her core. For the second time in 2 days, the heiress fought back the urge to cry. Not now. Don't cry now. Now is not the time, she demanded of herself within my mind. With all of her fortitude pressing back against the swirling storm brewing within her, Hinata managed a response. I have some catching up to do, then. I'm not all that fast, but I will not stop, she said through a quivering lip and clenched teeth. Something flashed across Naruto's eyes for a split second. An emotion that came and went too quickly for Hinata to identify. The blonde then turned his back to her and began to walk away. It won't be worth it, he said slowly before leaping up onto a nearby rooftop and bounding away. Hinata numbly watched him shrink into the distance. She had experienced plenty of emotional pain in her time, but this was of a different category. You can't convince me to stop. You don't even want me to stop. You just think you don't deserve the help. You think you're toxic, she thought tragically. He was well and truly a danger to himself. She was now entirely sure of it. You may believe those things, but I don't. I think you're beautiful. She swore to him into the dead air of the night. A heavy sigh then escaped her as she looked toward her home that lay on the opposite end of the village. And I'll fight for that beauty. Uruka nodded and waved a short greeting as Hinata entered the small, secluded cafe. It was the very earliest stages of the evening, with the clock reading only a minute or two past 5 o'clock. It was perhaps the only time of the day that functioned as a proper time for a meeting of the nature they were about to have. It wasn't early enough for their minds to still be hung up on academics, and not late enough for Hinata to be entirely consumed by Naruto Uzumaki and his situation. Though, the latter still somewhat applied given what they had come to discuss. Thank you for suggesting this place. It's about as quiet as I've seen a restaurant in Konoha. Uruka said gratefully as the heiress sat down across from him at the small window-side table he had claimed upon his earlier arrival. It's been a go-to of mine for several years now. It's a small business, so I'll like to come often, she explained jovially. The instructor took a sip from his half-finished glass of water and settled into a more professional posture. I'll probably end up a regular here if it's always this quiet. But that aside, we should probably get right down to it. I've got a bunch of essays to grade, he said. Hinata nodded and quickly ordered herself a glass of water of her own. Once the waitress had left to retrieve the beverage for her, Uruka began. Give me a basic outline of what you've gathered about him. I know it's only been 3 days, but I'm guessing there was quite a lot to digest regardless of the short time frame, he said. Hinata folded her hands on the table in front of her and took a deep breath. I am very concerned. No, closer to afraid. I knew I would hear and see some unhappy things when I first arrived, but it's been so much worse than I thought, she said with pursed lips and narrowed eyes. The older ninja assessed her carefully. Her stutter goes away when his safety is the topic. Interesting, he observed as she gathered herself to continue extrapolating on her recent experiences with the blonde boy. He only ever speaks of himself in negative terms, he routinely tries to push me away, and he's infinitely more defensive than he used to be. I also think he may be neglecting his own health. He hadn't touched any of his food in at least a few days when I first came to check on him, she revealed, garnering a solemn look from Uruka. I had noticed him getting more gaunt. I had my hunches about malnourishment, but flu season is raging right now, so I didn't pay it as much heed as I should have, he replied. Hinata momentarily plastered a pleasant look onto her face to thank the waitress for delivering her water, but quickly discarded the mask once the woman went back into the kitchen. I made him some fairly dense rice and chicken 2 nights ago, and I think he ate it if his pulse was any indication. I'm still not sure, though, and that bothers me. He's so much thinner than he usually is, she said tensely. The instructor downed the last of his water and pondered a number of things. Naruto's physical health declining alongside his mental health was the worst-case scenario, and unfortunately, it seemed to be reality if Hinata was to be believed. More drastic measures were needed than simple check-ins at the rate things were degrading. Despite this belief, it was nowhere near that simple. Schedules were difficult to bend for even trivial matters, and this was far from trivial. It would require a fair bit of time that Uruka simply did not have. This still should take priority. It's a child's well-being. I can live on my savings for a few weeks, he resolved. As he was about to voice this desired plan of his, Hinata chose to speak again. I have an idea. Something I want you to consider seriously, Uruka-sensei, she said, her expression serious and determined. The Chunin raised an eyebrow and motioned for her to elaborate. Would it be possible for me to be given the next month's worth of notes and assignments? I don't feel entirely comfortable leaving him alone all day anymore. Not after what he said last night. I'm very worried, she proposed. Uruka blinked at the suggestion and thought it over for a few moments. I guess I could throw that together for you, but you'd need to run that by your father first. I'm assuming he isn't aware of what I've assigned you to do, right? He pointed out. The heiress nodded and shifted a tad in her seat uncomfortably. I'm feeling optimistic about what he may say given what you revealed about his interaction with Naruto-kun. He's stern, but he's not cold. He might understand if I explained it to him, she said hopefully. Uruka fought the urge to wince. Yeah, good luck with that, kid. You know him better than I do, but he doesn't strike me as the type of man to be fine with his daughter spending her days at some boy who he's never met's apartment, he thought to himself. Choosing not to voice his uncensored opinion of her chances so as not to scare her out of her bold streak, the instructor simply nodded. Try to get that done sooner rather than later. I want arrangements made quickly, he said. Hinata nodded and finished the last of her water in short order. I think I'll go do that now. I still want to do my usual duties tonight, so I have no time to slack, she said before briskly exiting the cafe and leaving Iruka alone once again. As he watched her walk away through the large pane of glass, he sighed and shook his head. She's all in now. She's not going to take no for an answer. She's so worried about him that she stopped stuttering, he thought to himself. He had known upon selecting her for the task that she held a genuine affection for Naruto, but any doubts he may have had about that affection's depth were now completely for nil. He had easily sensed her exhaustion throughout their brief meeting. She's running herself ragged for this. She'll crash at some point, but I doubt she'll let it happen anytime soon. They'll probably fold in on each other. That could be good, or really, really bad. Iruka pondered silently. It was slowly slipping out of his hands. Whether that was for the best or not remained to be seen. Regardless of outcome, his expectations had been subverted strongly. Hinata took several deep breaths as she stood before the entrance to her father's study. It was a room she hardly ever ventured to of her own accord. While she did love her father, he was far from friendly, and rarely did much more than give a curt nod when spoken to by his children. He was a man of few words, and a man of timeliness. Seeking him out was only ever advisable if one knew exactly what they were going to say and why. For the first time in quite some time, Hinata felt that she had met those prerequisites. With a slightly trembling hand, the heiress knocked on the wooden door 3 times and waited patiently. An odd beat later, the authoritative voice of the head of the Hyuga clan acknowledged her. Enter. He called slowly. Hinata nodded to herself and carefully pushed the hefty door open before stepping into the study in as measured a fashion as she could manage in spite of her nerves. Once inside, she spotted her father facing the entrance she had come through in the chair he always occupied. Almost as though he had been expecting her. I take it you have something to discuss with me, Hinata? He inquired calmly as his daughter bowed and met his steady, formidable gaze. Hinata straightened her posture and nodded once again. Yes, I do. I would like you to hear me out on something, she replied, mentally kicking herself for the early stutter in the sentence. Hiyashi's expression shifted ever so slightly. I have the time, so speak. Be as detailed as you feel necessary, he said. Hinata took a few moments to calculate how exactly to approach such a topic, and how to word it correctly. A classmate of mine has fallen ill in more ways than one. He has no one available to assist him, and I feel obligated to fill in that gap. As such, I requested that Iruka-sensei give me 1 month's worth of assignments and notes in advance so that I may spend more time assisting my classmate, she explained in her most eloquent of cadences. Her father's response was instant and surprising. Naruto Uzumaki. Do I have that right? He asked simply. Hinata tensed instantly and immediately began to doubt what little planning she had been afforded before engaging the conversation. Yes, you're correct, she admitted quietly. She fully expected to be sent away with a refusal and a light scolding. Much to her relief, no such reprimand came her way. Tell me more. Hiyashi pressed with a difficult to decipher expression on his face. He appeared no more irritated than he had been before, which seemed to be something of a good sign. Allowing herself to breathe once more, Hinata sifted through all that she knew of Naruto's condition within her mind. He stopped coming to school several weeks ago. I thought he was simply sick at first, but when a few days turned into more than a week, I started to wonder. Then, Iruka-sensei called me back into the classroom after hours 4 days ago. He informed me that Naruto-kun had begun to isolate himself. He sent me to check in on him nightly. She began, allowing her father to process the information being presented to him before continuing. Quite the interesting honorific you just attached to his name. But please, do go on. He urged her, the slightest trace of a smirk flashing across his features. Hinata felt her face heat up, but kept her embarrassment on a mental leash. I did as I was told. Both because I wished to ease my teacher's stress, and because I personally wished to check on him. What I have found so far is distressing. He only ever speaks of himself negatively, he lays inert in bed seemingly all day, and he's begun to stop eating. And last night, she said, trailing off near the end as she forced herself to return to the painful conversation she had shared with the blonde. He began to say things about how he was unworthy of help, and not worth the trouble of assisting. He's unraveling. I can feel it when I speak with him. She continued. There was then a brief pause. It hurts me, father, she said in a quiet, melancholy tone. For a painstakingly long time, Hiyashi simply studied his daughter while maintaining his silence. It was unnerving and stressful. Fortunately for Hinata's erratic heart rate, he eventually did speak. For you to come here and tell me all of this so openly took a great deal of bravery. Be proud of yourself. As for what I've just learned, I know what you fear I may say to this. And believe me, I have half a mind to make those fears a reality. He started, taking a brief moment to adjust his robes. But, I also fully understand what you're experiencing at present. You're empathetic. You always have been. You see him suffer, and so you suffer as well. It's who you are. Beyond that, the way you say his name, both in tone and the honorific you used, tells me that this concern runs deeper than that. He said calmly. Hinata opened her mouth to interject, but thought better of it when her father eyed her intently. I don't much like the idea of you taking time away from the academy, but if you truly, genuinely fear that he is a danger to himself, I will allow it one time and one time only. If I find that you are doing anything other than nursing him back to health, then you will be disciplined. Are we clear on that? He concluded. The heiress was taken aback by his acceptance of her proposal, and could do little to hide it. Why yes, I understand. IW will do all that I can. She responded gratefully. She then rose to her feet and turned her back to exit the room. Just before she could reach the door of the study, Hiyashi called out to her once more. I know that you're likely wondering what my opinion of him is, given how reviled he is. He said, drawing Hinata's attention back to him once again and prompting her to turn back around. Once their eyes met again, the older man stood to his feet. Naruto Uzumaki is harmless, in my opinion. He isn't especially polished in any way from what I've seen, but he's no more problematic than any other child his age, he said, drawing a relieved look from his daughter. I'm glad that you see that as well. So many others treat him unfairly, she said with a smile. Hiyashi then shook his head, much to her surprise. While I don't agree with his ostracization, I do understand why he's treated the way he is, wrong as it may be. There is a shared reason for the neglect and disdain, he said. The heiress, expression contorted at his words. There's no justifying how he's treated. He's a good, worthwhile person, she said firmly. Hiyashi mentally applauded the girl for having the fortitude to debate with him. There's more to it than that, Hinata. It isn't as simple as what's right and what's wrong. Fear breeds hate, and hate breeds abuse. He's suffering the brunt of human nature. As I said, I don't agree with his treatment, but I also understand why things are the way they are, the clan head said. Hinata pursed her lips into a tight line. Why would they fear him? He's never harmed a fly. He even risked his health to protect me from a group of bullies several years ago. Why on earth do they hate him this way? She questioned rigidly. Hiyashi sighed and shook his head. It isn't my place to say. If you insist on inserting yourself into his life, you'll likely learn in time. What you think of it when that time comes is entirely up to you. Perhaps you will fear him as well, he replied. The heiress fought to control her temper at the suggestion, and fortunately, she succeeded. Never. She hissed under her breath. Hiyashi raised an eyebrow and took note of just how tightly wound his daughter was. She had always possessed a temper buried beneath her shyness, but it only ever became visible in situations of fairly extreme emotion. This certainly does explain the diary entry I found earlier this year. Such a steadfast commitment. How interesting. He thought to himself. I'll extend your curfew 1 hour for the next 30 days. Do for him as you see fit, he said before turning his chair back toward his desk. It was a cue for Hinata to go about her business, and she easily understood it. Thank you, father, she muttered. She then promptly exited the room and left her father to himself once again. The clan head heaved a heavy sigh once her footsteps grew faint enough. Tread carefully, my daughter. While I don't find Naruto himself to be of any threat to you, what he holds within him scares me very much, he thought to himself darkly. He then glanced out the window. At least he's brought out your strength of will. Hinata mentally congratulated herself as she found her nerves to be far less crippling than they had been only the night before as she turned her spare key to unlock Naruto's apartment door. She had opted to slow herself down a tad by picking up boxed meals from a local takeout store, but the hour was still more than reasonable. Her spirits were high after being granted both more time and a blessing to school herself for the next month. Breaking the news to you isn't going to be easy, but you're going to have to accept it. She silently projected to Naruto as she stepped into his dwelling and manifested her Byakugan to locate him. Though it took her a few seconds, she eventually did find him. He was sitting up straight on his mattress in his bedroom. He was clearly conscious, which was good. He was also not moving much, and his head was buried in his knees. Deciding that it would be best not to wait to notify him of her presence, Hinata briskly walked to the bedroom door. "It's me, Naruto-kun. Forgive my lateness," she called to him through the door as she knocked on the wood. For a time, no response came. With her concern mounting, Hinata tried the handle. Predictably, it was locked. Undeterred, Hinata tried the lock again. Something then slammed into the opposite side of the door. "Not right now. Go home," came Naruto's voice from just behind the door. The impact had likely come from his fist. Hinata felt her worries increase tenfold. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" she pressed urgently. Naruto audibly sighed within the bedroom and moved something inside. "I'm fine. I just don't want to see anybody right now. Now leave me alone," he said. The heiress was far from convinced by his tone or his words. "Come out and prove that you're okay. Or do I need to come in and check on you myself?" she challenged him. All of her nervousness and social anxiety had given way to her overpowering concern. "The door is locked. You're not getting in," he retorted. The Hyuga girl gripped the handle once again and narrowed her eyes. "How sure of that are you?" she shot back. It was a bluff, but a believable one. The many odd abilities of the Hyuga clan had created something of a mirage of mysticism. Luckily for her, Naruto fell for it. Slowly but surely, the door slid open. Stepping back to allow him the space to exit into the hall, Hinata eyed him carefully as he stepped out. "What are those?" she thought to herself. The blonde was wearing a black short-sleeved t-shirt as he had been the past few days, but the sleeves were ruffled and pulled up a bit to reveal the upper half of his arms. His triceps and shoulders were covered in what appeared to be scratches inflicted by nails. Some of them were fairly unconcerning, but others were red and bloody. "Oh God, he's hurting himself," she thought to herself as her left hand covered her mouth. She was then left in the hall as Naruto turned and made his way into the kitchen. Hinata immediately went after him and stepped around him to intercept him. "What happened to your arms?" she demanded. The blonde's face twitched slightly and he momentarily allowed some of what was likely dwelling just below his fabricated calm to surface. "I told you to leave," he said hoarsely. The heiress fought to control herself as she kept her eyes away from the scratch marks. "If I had left, would you have hurt yourself even more?" she asked. Naruto's shell immediately reinforced itself around him. His expression hardened, his posture straightened. "What I do in my own home is none of your business. I'm not ready to come back to school. That's all you need to know," he snapped back. Hinata's jaw tightened. "Stop doing that. Stop trying to run away and hide. You aren't convincing me of anything. You aren't okay. You're digging your own nails into your skin. And at this point, I couldn't care less what you think of me being here. In less than a week, you've made it perfectly clear that you need to be cared for," she said indignantly. The blonde's eyes remained dull as he wore a false look of composure. "Have you ever considered that I might be doing this for a reason? That maybe it's for the best. It was either this or running away. I'm only here because there's no way I could have outrun the hunters," he said vaguely. Hinata shook her head and held her ground. "There is no good reason for you to self-harm and lock yourself away. Your life is worth so much more than that. You're precious. You matter," she insisted. Her classmates seemed to stare right through her. "Who do I matter to, then?" he asked simply. The heiress folded her hands over her chest and finally allowed her sorrow to show on her face. "Me. So much," Seeing you suffer is making it difficult to sleep at night for me. I could never live with myself if I let you waste away. I won't sit by and let that happen. I'm not here to make you come back to school. I have 1,000 other things I could be doing with my time, but I'm choosing to be here with you, and I'll keep on coming back until you come back to me, she said passionately. At these words, Naruto hung his head and wiped a speck of blood from his shoulder. I'm sorry, Hinata. It has to be this way. It just does. He muttered. Seeing that her words were falling on deaf ears, the heiress simply reached forward and pulled him into a wordless embrace. Why are you trying so hard? I don't know you very well. I haven't done anything for you, and I don't have anything to give you. Just, why? The blonde asked as the Hyuga girl squeezed his abdomen and rested her forehead just below his chin. You have done things for me without realizing it, and what you can give me is the knowledge that you aren't going to stop living. Even if that takes time, I'll stay to hear those words, she replied. She then made a bit of space between them and looked him in the eyes. And you'll have plenty of chances to get to know me from here on out. I'll be receiving this next month's schoolwork from Iruka-sensei tomorrow. I'm going to be right here with you as many days as I can be, she revealed. Naruto, who had remained silent throughout her miniature speech, gave her a questioning look. Who said that I'd even let you do that? He countered. Hinata gave him a bored look and brushed a strand of hair behind her left ear. I have a key, and you couldn't take it from me if you tried. I'll still leave at around 9 or 10, but during the day, you're stuck with me, Naruto-kun, she said firmly. Seeming to come to the conclusion that there was no point in arguing, which there very much wasn't, Naruto sighed and turned toward the hall once again. I'm gonna go clean up the blood, he said quietly as he trekked toward his bathroom. Hinata looked on with mixed emotion as her classmates slowly walked away. Naruto-kun, she called to him. Naruto stopped walking, but kept his eyes fixed straight ahead of him. His response came slowly. Yeah, he replied quietly. Hinata allowed herself to smile for the first time since her arrival only minutes ago. Even if it isn't under the best circumstances, I'm glad to be here with you. Hinata stared at the page intently as she ran the sequences of equations through her mind. Math had never been her strong suit, and she disliked it immensely. As such, she had opted to eliminate it from the day's lineup of work right away. It was early, hardly 7 in the morning, and the heiress had arrived in Naruto's kitchen around a half an hour prior. She had done so quietly enough to not wake him. She somewhat feared how he would react to her being in his home before his awakening, but also considered it to be necessary. To observe him all throughout the day, and to ensure his safety from himself, she would need to be in his vicinity for as long as possible. She had eaten an exceptionally early breakfast, and had packed extra for the blonde once he came to and left his room. How does trigonometry apply to being a ninja, exactly? She pondered to herself boredly. She then sighed. She was less than halfway through the equations, and they only seemed to grow more complex with each problem. Once the math was complete, the rest was nothing but note-taking, which she excelled at in most subjects. Shaking her head slightly, the heiress stood to her feet. I forgot to wash my face this morning. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I used his bathroom, she thought to herself as an excuse to take a momentary break from the equations. She then briskly made her way to the hallway and to the leftmost door. Turning the handle gently, she slipped inside the room. As she had expected, the bathroom was quite basic and uninteresting once she flipped the light on to observe it. As a pleasant surprise, it was fairly clean. She quickly identified the sink and turned on the water to use to wash her face. When she looked down into the sink, however, she saw something that sent a shudder through her. Blood stains were speckled across the basin of the sink. They were fairly fresh, though they had faded somewhat with the presence of the water. All signs still pointed to them being from the previous night. At this realization, Hinata felt a lump form in her throat. To think that you resorted to abusing yourself. The pain you were in must have been horrifying. Both mentally and physically. She thought to herself rigidly. She quickly pushed down her emotions and looked to the mirror in front of her. Well, no more. You won't suffer alone. I'll do that bleeding for you if I must, she said aloud. For the next minute or two, she used water to clean her face thoroughly, feeling as though she had to be at the peak of her appearance. Once she was satisfied with herself, she smiled at the mirror and exited the bathroom. The following 20 minutes consisted of yet more equation solving. It was dull work, and it hardly felt meaningful, but Hinata did as she had been assigned to do. When the clock struck 7:30, the heiress' ears were alerted to rustling coming from within the bedroom. Immediately straightening her pencils and papers to make them more presentable, Hinata patiently awaited his exit with bated breath. It took longer than she had anticipated, but the blonde did eventually emerge. When he did, he groggily dragged out of the bedroom while rubbing sleep out of his eyes. He was wearing an orange set of pajamas, and his hair was disheveled. Hinata couldn't help but smile at the sight. She found it to be exceptionally cute. The blonde then noticed her and silently stared at her for a few moments, seemingly too tired to process what he was seeing all at once. After a time, he finally spoke. "You could at least wait for me to wake up before showing up," he said tiredly. The heiress internally celebrated. It wasn't a jovial greeting, but it wasn't a complete recoil at her presence. "I'd prefer to be here from the beginnings of your days to the very ends of them." "Did I wake you early?" Hinata replied. The blonde shrugged his shoulders and made his way over to the couch, promptly flopping down onto it loosely upon reaching it. "Yeah, by about 2 hours." He grumbled as he curled up and prepared to sleep once again. The Hyuga girl momentarily felt guilty, but soon overcame it. "At least eat breakfast before you go to sleep again," she suggested. Naruto rolled over to face away from her in response and stayed silent. The heiress frowned at this and weighed her options. She could always leave him be, but allowing him to further sink into his unhealthy habits was unwise. There was also the path of simply badgering him until he ate, which would almost certainly aggravate him, but it would be the best for his well-being. Either I cater to what he wants and let him degrade, or I damage my standing with him by doing what's best for him, she thought to herself. It was a fairly simple decision to make upon further thought. Standing to her feet with a sigh, Hinata walked over to the prone boy and stood over him. "You have 2 options for breakfast. Do you prefer chicken or rice?" she asked. Her classmate did not respond. The heiress stared down at him silently at first, unsure of how exactly to approach rousing him. "I know you're awake. Ignoring me won't help you, Naruto-kun," she said quietly. After working up a fair amount of courage, the Hyuga girl reached down and shook him by the shoulder. It took 3 tries to finally get him to acknowledge her. "Look, I'm just not hungry, okay?" he groaned after a minute of being shaken by Hinata. The heiress' eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You hardly ate any of what I brought you last night, and I know you eat very little on your own. You're definitely hungry," she said. Naruto finally rolled over to face her. "I don't want to eat." "I'm not kidding," he said firmly. Hinata held eye contact with him and shook her head once again. "You need to eat. You need to stay fed and healthy," she insisted. The blonde scowled and sat up straight on the couch. "I can live for 3 weeks without food. I read that somewhere," he countered. The heiress felt her irritation begin to increase. He was being unreasonably difficult, and she couldn't quite discern why. Opting to try a different tactic, she briefly returned to the table, where the food she had brought along with her sat. A half-beat later, she returned to her position standing in front of him. "You're going to eat. I won't let you weasel your way out of this," she said, presenting the bento to him. Naruto's face twitched as he eyed the food with a look of discomfort on his face. His emotions were difficult to read. No one emotion showed strongly enough on his face to be pinned down as the primary culprit for his strange behavior. "Please eat it," she said a bit more softly. Finally seeming to concede, Naruto reached out and took the bento into his hands. He then opened it and peered inside. It was the chicken she had previously referenced. Realizing that she had forgotten to give him chopsticks, the heiress quickly scampered back to the table and retrieved them from their plastic wrapping. "Thanks," the blonde muttered, taking the utensils from her and focusing his attention on the food in his lap. Slowly but surely, he began to eat. While he did so, the heiress continued to stand over him with a light smile on her face. From what she could gather from his small reactions, he was enjoying the food. Eventually, Naruto glanced up at her. "Could you not stare at me while I'm eating?" he requested. Much to his chagrin, Hinata shook her head and remained as she was. "I'm going to watch you until you're finished. I want you to eat it all," she replied. The blonde mumbled some sort of retort under his breath, but complained no further. It was slow and reluctant, but he finished the entirety of the chicken. You're a good cook, Naruto said after having finished the absolute last of the food. The compliment immediately caused Hinata to redden and begin to fidget. Of all the things she had hoped to one day hear from Naruto, confirmation of her culinary skill had been near the top of the list. Thank you versus very much. I have more if you're still hungry, she stammered gratefully. Though she mentally kicked herself for allowing her stutter to return, she was far too overjoyed to care. The blonde actually seemed to consider the offer momentarily, but soon shook his head and laid back down on the couch. No, I'm good. I'm going to sleep now, he said as he closed his eyes. For a time, Hinata simply gazed at his unmoving form. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She now knew she could convince him to eat with enough pressure. Surprisingly, his breathing had evened within the first 2 minutes of him having closed his eyes. He was already asleep. As he dozed, the heiress glanced over to her schoolwork. I'll have to be careful, but I can make it work, she thought to herself. As quietly as she could, Hinata went back to the dining table and gathered her things. She then carried them back over to the couch and sat herself down in the gap between Naruto's feet and the end of the sofa. He wasn't quite tall enough to fully occupy the piece of furniture, so there was just enough space for the Hyuga girl to sit. There were a number of benefits to the arrangement, and chief among them was proximity. She could now look at his face while she worked if she so wished, and she could be at the ready in case something somehow went wrong during his slumber. For a time, Hinata simply gazed across his body at his face. She was struck by how unbothered he looked. No stress, no melancholy, no pain. Simple serenity. That peace is what I strive to restore, she thought to herself. Despite her success in making him eat, she could still feel how daunting a task it would be to truly return him to whom he usually was. Much of it would likely not fall to Hinata herself. There were battles to be fought within Naruto himself. All she could do was help him along. As she pondered all of these things, Naruto stirred slightly and let out a soft groan. Though she was momentarily concerned, Hinata quickly realized that he was in no pain, and had simply shifted for the sake of comfort. At this realization, she smiled. You're adorable, she quietly whispered to the unconscious boy. Though she was well aware that she had not been heard, Hinata still found her face slightly warm at having voiced such an affectionate remark. I'm hopeless, she muttered to herself. There was likely a shred of truth to the sentiment, but she also knew at her core that she likely cared for him more than anybody other than possible Iruka or the Hokage. It was a reality that both saddened and hardened her. Naruto deserved, nearly more than anyone else, to be cared for and appreciated, but she also took some pride in the truth that she saw what others could not. Pride versus sympathy. The frequency with which the former prevailed in regards to her feelings toward Naruto's treatment was a thing Hinata took great shame in. She had long worked to correct it, and while she had made progress, it was still an active problem. Seeing him so low and damaged had indeed sobered her opinion somewhat, though. It had also taught her a thing or two about the true depth of his struggles. The smile he wore day in and day out was blatantly fake to the discerning eye, but it hid far more than the heiress had anticipated. It was nearly certain that the depression he now suffered from had been built up and bottled for years leading up to his collapse, and no one had known. Not even Hinata herself. You're an excellent actor. A far better on than I'd given you credit for, she silently projected to her classmate sadly. She then took a deep breath. She still had schoolwork to complete despite her desire to continue staring and pondering. While she still despised math, she found it to be far more bearable with Naruto asleep directly to her left. Naruto sat silently in the darkness with his knees drawn up to his chin. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and he had had limited success sleeping past his morning nap on the couch. It was irritating. The night was quiet, and it was boring. During his days alone prior to Hinata's arrival as a daytime companion, he had taken to listening closely to the sounds he heard just outside of his apartment. It was a good way to think of anything but himself. He had even gone as far as to jot them down in a journal. The entries were all jumbled and fairly meaningless, but they served as a useful food for thought. Anything to pass the time in unharmful fashion was a welcome method. He had learned the hard way that allowing himself to sink too deep into his own mind had consequences. At this recollection, the scratch marks on Naruto's arms pulsed with dull pain. He considered it all to be deserved torment, but it still hurt nonetheless. If I had left, would you have hurt yourself even more? Hinata's words rattled around in his skull for the umpteenth time in the past day or so. They bothered him for reasons he couldn't pin down. Part of it had been her tone. Such unbridled concern and pain being directed toward him was a foreign experience for Naruto. The look in her eyes had greatly unsettled him. She had looked utterly heartbroken by the idea of him harming himself. Try as he might, he couldn't sort out how he felt about it all. Me. So much. Seeing you suffer is making it difficult to sleep at night for me. I could never live with myself if I let you waste away. I won't sit by and let that happen. I'm not here to make you come back to school. I have 1,000 other things I could be doing with my time, but I'm choosing to be here with you, and I'll keep on coming back until you come back to me. Why? Why do you care? Why are you wasting your time? You're so much better than me. You have a family. You have a future. You're going to be something. I might not even be alive next week. Naruto questioned in silent agony. He did not understand. He was completely at a loss. Iruka acted as something of an older brother to the boy, but even then, he rarely strayed from his own schedule to spend time with him. Even Hiruzen was fairly neglectful beyond paying for his apartment. Never before had a person taken such painstaking measures to spend time with him for no benefit of their own. The way she looked at him, the way she spoke to him, it all made very little sense to the blonde. She gazed at him with wide-eyed concern. She said his name with a tenderness that raised a number of other questions that Naruto was ill-equipped to answer. You don't understand what's going on. You have no idea how bad an idea it is for you to be around me. Naruto thought to himself darkly as he felt something shift around in the depths of his mind. A chill then reverberated through him. It was a feeling he had experienced dozens of times in recent weeks, but he had never truly grown used to it. Come out already. Don't just sneak around inside me. Talk. Naruto hissed to the silent room. At first, nothing came back in response. Just as Naruto began to shift his focus back to attempting to sleep, however, he was answered. Are you sure you want to talk to me? Because I feel like you really don't. Came a dark, deep voice. The blonde shuddered at the sound and gripped the sleeves of his shirt tightly. I'm not afraid of you. He retorted weakly. The voice chuckled lowly within his mind and let any veils of censorship it had erected drop away so as to make Naruto feel its presence in full. Given what you've done to yourself upon your discovery of me, I'd call that a lie. A poor one, at that. You fear me greatly. The ancient voice shot back. The being, whoever it was clearly male. The tone was deep, and the inflection menacing. You can't hurt me. It's my body, not yours. Naruto said through clenched teeth as he buried his face in his knees. Another chuckle escaped the being within his mind. A moment later, the academy student's nails lengthened to snarled claws. You're right, it is your body. I don't need to control it for you to hurt yourself. I can feel your shame. I can smell just how much you despise yourself for being who you are. Feel free to use those claws just like you did before. We both know you want to. The voice urged him. Naruto fought desperately to control his breathing. He was utterly petrified, as evidenced by the tremors racking his frame. There's no reason for me to self-harm. I matter. He said shakily. At this, the ancient voice laughed out loud in mean-spirited fashion. You have no words of your own to pick yourself up with, so you quote the little whore. How touching. Grow up, child. She isn't your savior. Nobody is. The voice said mockingly. At his words, Naruto's clawed hands tightened into fists, opening small cuts on his palms. Don't call her that. Shut the hell up. He growled. The being, much to his surprise, remained silent for a few moments. Unfortunately, it did not signify any sort of retreat. You have a poor habit of only seeing the first layer of people. You see her kindness, and so you cling to it, whether you know how to express that or not. You cannot see what lies below her surface. She's exactly like the others. She's just far craftier. The voice said darkly. This time, Naruto did not respond. He simply sat inertly on the mattress with his eyes dull and voided. Realizing that he was shutting himself down, the ancient being sighed and began to slink away. I'll let your memories speak for themselves. Let's rewind to all the times you've been backstabbed, shall we? He said before disappearing into the chasms of Naruto's mind. All Naruto could do was whimper in the face of all his past pains. Naruto fought the urge to yawn as he slowly wrapped the gauze around his hands. The previous night had been anything but fun, but he had escaped with nothing more than minor lacerations on his hands. He had even managed to get an hour or two of sleep near the end. Not a perfect night by any means, but less violent than it could have been. It was the crack of dawn, and while he was still tired, Naruto knew that Hinata was due to arrive within the next 45 minutes. Above all else, he did not want her to see the injury. It's not all that bad, and it'll heal within a week, but she got really shaken up the last time she saw the cuts. She's got better things to do than fawn over me, the blonde thought to himself as he pulled the wrapping tightly with his teeth. The girl was clearly fragile despite her strong words and unwavering conviction to help him, and the blonde intended to defend her innocence from the worst of his problems. She doesn't need to know. She doesn't deserve that kind of stress, he thought firmly. He was still largely unsure of what he thought of Hinata Hyuga as a whole, but he held no ill will toward her in any way. She was genuinely, legitimately kind. That much was clear to him now. What concerned him was how committed she seemed to be to the notion of uncovering the deeper roots of his struggles. The heiress' shy demeanor hid an intensity that only ever seemed to show itself when she was greatly concerned for the well-being of the blonde, and she tended to be stubborn in those moments. More stubborn than Naruto had the energy to resist in most cases of late. It was a predicament he had no solution for, and the circumstances themselves were paradoxical. She cared too much rather than not enough. It was a puzzling reality to grapple with given how little he felt like he knew about her. She's next in line to lead her clan, she can cook, she's pretty cute, and that's about all I know. I mean, I don't dislike any of that, but the way she acts is so weird. It makes no sense. Naruto pondered silently as he laid down on the couch upon completing his bandages. From there, he simply allowed his mind to drift aimlessly as he stared up at the ceiling. For the next half an hour, he lay inert without moving a muscle. He was shaken from this trance by the predictable sound of his door unlocking. As expected, Hinata quickly slipped in his door and quietly shut the door behind her. Humorously, it took her a moment to notice that he was already out of his room and on the couch. When she caught sight of him, she squeaked in surprise and quickly straightened her posture. "Oh, you're up early, Naruto-kun." She greeted him with a hasty, awkward smile. The blonde rubbed his eyes and stretched to relieve some of the stiffness in his joints. "I had something to take care of. I might go back to bed in a few minutes," he replied. The heiress responded by immediately reaching into her bag and producing a bento. At the sight of it, Naruto's left eye twitched. It seemed they were about to play the same game they had the morning prior. He had no desire to eat. It had truthfully been more than a week since he had eaten more than one meal in a day, but it mattered little. Food held little appeal. "Can we not do this right now?" he grumbled. Hinata shook her head and walked up to the couch. She then sat down next to him and set the bento on his lap. "There are chopsticks inside. Now please eat. You can go back to bed when you're done eating," she said. Her tone made it perfectly clear in the gentlest way that it was not up for debate. She sounded like an ever so slightly incensed mother. Naruto reluctantly opened the package and took out the chopsticks. It was rice with small bits of vegetable and chicken spaced throughout. "Staring at it won't put it in your stomach, Naruto-kun." Hinata pressed as he stubbornly refused to begin eating. The blonde responded by simply poking at it with the chopsticks. At this, the heiress sighed and took the bento back from him. Thinking he had won, Naruto relaxed and began to think about other things. These thoughts were sorely interrupted by the feeling of a piece of chicken being lightly pressed on the side of his lips. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked awkwardly as Hinata poked at his mouth with the food-carrying chopsticks. The girl's face was slightly red, but her expression was just as bored and unwavering as it had been before. "If you won't do it, then I'll feed you. You aren't getting out of eating, like I told you yesterday. Now open up," she said bluntly. Naruto immediately reddened to match her. For a few moments, they simply sat in uncomfortable silence. Eventually, Naruto conceded and bit the chicken off the chopsticks. The heiress, lips tugged into a satisfied smile that she tried and failed to suppress. See, that wasn't so bad. Now, do we need to keep on doing it this way, or are you going to act your age and eat it by yourself? She asked. The blonde grumbled something to himself and took the bento and chopsticks. Hinata almost looked disappointed as he began to eat the rice meal. Once he was finished, he set the bento aside and glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. You got a real kick out of that, didn't you? He said. Hinata gave him a light smile and shrugged her shoulders. It was quite endearing, I must say. But I'm glad I don't have to baby you through your meals, she said jovially. She was clearly quite pleased with herself. Naruto leaned back on the couch and drummed his fingers on his own thigh. Don't you have homework to do or something? He asked. The Hyuga girl shook her head and remained in her seat only a few feet from him. I worked ahead last night. I got the next 3 days worth done. In other words, I'm able to enjoy myself here far more, she explained. Naruto chuckled and gestured widely to the room around them. I'm kind of boring. Even more than I normally am. You're probably gonna be bored to tears inside of an hour or two, he said. Hinata's response came back at him with near automatic speed. Being here with you is all I need. You did complain that you don't know me very well the other day, so consider this your chance to change that, she shot back. Though he was briefly taken aback by her directness, Naruto opted to make the most of his situation. Fine, fine. So, what are your hobbies? He asked as an opener. Hinata folded her hands in her lap and settled into her spot. Well, I enjoy cooking quite a bit. My mother taught me everything I know about it. I also like to press flowers sometimes. Gardens in general, really. I love plant life, she said with an easy look of contentment on her face. Even in his current state, Naruto couldn't help but smile just a tad. You're girly as hell, he commented jokingly. Hinata's cheeks gained color. She then gave him a shy look. Is that good or bad? She asked. Naruto found that he had not fully planned for what he would say to such a question. As such, he simply scratched the back of his head and spit out the first thing that came to mind. Well, yeah, I think so. I like girls, he said awkwardly. It was Hinata's turn to laugh, and she did in the form of a reserved giggle. I'm glad that I'm to your liking, she teased him. The response seemed to surprise them both, because neither of them could hide their embarrassment as they sat in socially inept silence. Yeah, I think Iruka chose the right person, Naruto said quietly. Hinata's eyes widened slightly. She then smiled inwardly and fiddled with her jacket sleeves. You've talked more this morning than you have in all the time I've been checking on you. I'd like to think that means I'm doing my job, she said softly. A half beat later, she continued. Not that I consider this a hassle or a task. It makes me happy to see you being more yourself, she added quickly. The blonde turned his head to study her. She looked genuinely content. You're so much less stuttery than you were. You could hardly talk like a week ago, he said. The heiress met his gaze slowly. I still stutter sometimes, but I know that I need to be strong for you. You aren't okay. I know you aren't feeling well, even right now. If I'm going to support you and give you a shoulder to lean on, I can't be tripping over myself, she explained. Naruto felt a spark of warmth ignite in him deep down. It quickly died, but he held fast to the brief flare and shelved the feeling. You really shouldn't get your hopes up, Hinata. There's more to this than you can solve, he said carefully. The heiress leaned forward a bit and tilted her head to one side. Why don't you tell me about it then? If I know, then maybe I can adjust and help, she suggested. Naruto firmly shook his head and lowered his eyes to the ground. I don't like being hated, so I'll pass, he muttered. He had fully expected to be reprimanded for his words, but instead, Hinata diverted his expectations and stood to her feet. There's a place I'd like to show you. Come and walk with me, Naruto-kun, she said. Finding that he had no opposition to the idea, Naruto suppressed a yawn and rose to meet her. Where to? He asked as they exited the apartment. The Hyuga girl shook her head and fell into step with him on his left side. I'll explain when we arrive. Hinata gave her fellow clan members a challenging look as she led Naruto through the front lot of the Hyuga estate. They all looked more than a bit puzzled by her having brought the village pariah into their home, and while their reactions made a bit of sense on some level, they were still uncalled for by Hinata's estimation. Once they had taken the silent hint and returned to their business, the heiress picked up her pace and gestured to Naruto to keep up. "Can I ask where we're going yet?" he said quizzically. He looked quite uncomfortable, and seemed apprehensive about being within the dwelling of Konoha's most powerful family. Considering his background and upbringing, or lack thereof on both fronts, he likely felt completely alien in such a place. "It won't be long. Be patient, Naruto-kun," she replied as they entered through the front door of the main building. The first person they encountered was perhaps the last Hinata had wanted to see so soon into Naruto's visit to the estate. Standing with his back leaned against the wall and a newspaper in one hand was Hiashi Hyuga. At the sight of him, Hinata instantly stopped walking, which prompted her classmate to do the same. "Well now, this is certainly a surprise," the clan head said as he looked the pair up and down. His gaze lingered far longer on Naruto, and his eyes were scrutinizing, but they also held no malice beyond his general intimidation factor. "I just wanted to show him something of mine, father," Hinata said with a bow. Though he was socially unstructured in most regards, Hiyashi's presence held enough weight that Naruto immediately followed suit. "Fair enough. Try not to disturb the elders. They have a meeting in session down the hall and to the left," the older man informed her. At this, Hinata frowned a bit. "Why are you not in attendance, if I may ask?" she inquired. Hiyashi gave her a tired look and rolled up his newspaper. "Even I grow weary of politics from time to time. They can sort this out without me. It's just a dispute over property lines again," he explained. The heiress nodded and tugged on Naruto's shirt to catch his attention once again. "In that case, we'll be off. Come, Naruto-kun," she urged the boy. Obviously eager to be away from the head of the Hyuga clan, for both the sake of his nerves and his incomplete etiquette, the blonde eagerly followed after her. Once they were out of Hiyashi's earshot, they both relaxed somewhat. "That went quite well. He usually questions my sister far more when she brings friends home. Though, he did seem quite tired this time," she said. Naruto shuddered and scratched the back of his head. "He's scary," he murmured, drawing a slight chuckle from Hinata and a shake of her head. It was the most common reaction to her father, and it was somewhat justified given his status, but she still found it quite amusing given how broadly ordinary the man was underneath his regality. A few moments later, they reached the door to where she had intended to bring Naruto all along. Opting to make sure of something before opening it, Hinata manifested her Byakugan. Seeing that the area was uninhabited for the time being, the heiress let the dojutsu fizzle out and turned to her classmate, who was waiting for more prompting. "It's been some time since I've shown somebody this, so, bear with me, okay?" she said quietly. She then opened the door and directed him through it. Once they were both through the entrance, Hinata resumed her role as leader. "Oh, wow, you've got a whole inner area," Naruto said as he scanned his eyes around the inner courtyard of the estate. In the center of it was a small, but well-kept garden area. Hinata then led him to it and into its center, which had a miniature clearing just large enough for people to stand within. "This is where I like to come to relieve stress. I tinker around with the flowers, water the soil, that kind of thing," she explained while she brushed a finger over a rose. Naruto seemed to be impressed by the garden, as he continually glanced around with a look of thinly veiled awe. "This is fancy. Your gardeners must make a killing off of this," he said. Hinata stopped tending to the flowers and looked back at him. "Actually, this is mine. It was a birthday present from my mother when I was small. I've been caring for it ever since. Though, I think she was a better gardener than I am," she said with a reminiscent smile. Her classmate seemed to ponder something momentarily. It took Hinata very little time to identify what he was processing. "Yes, was. My mother. She passed away several years ago. She was a wonderful woman," she said quietly. Naruto immediately lowered his eyes to the ground and assumed a look of guilt. "I'm sorry for bringing that back," he muttered apologetically. Touched by his concern, the heiress turned to face him fully. "You don't need to apologize. My memories of her are happy ones. That's what matters," she assured him. Naruto nodded and met her gaze. "Why'd you bring me here?" he asked. Hinata remained silent for a moment before reaching forward and taking hold of his hands, both of which were thinly wrapped in bandages. She had noticed the amateur attempt to hide the injuries immediately upon entering his home that morning. To prove a point to you. You told me back at your apartment that you don't want to tell me everything because you're afraid of being hated by me. Well, let me make this perfectly clear to you. I would never. Not in 1,000 years. She began, pausing to allow her words to properly resonate with the boy standing in front of her. I know that you wrapped your hands to try to hide the cuts and blood on them. Probably because you didn't want me to worry about you. There are many, many people who would flaunt their injuries for attention, but not you. You hid them to save me the stress, or at least, you tried to. She continued. The guilt quickly returned to Naruto's face. I'm sorry. I just didn't want to freak you out again, he said apologetically. Hinata maintained her grip on his bandaged hands. And I appreciate the thought, but you need to understand that I want to know when you're hurting. Seeing you be in pain is torture for me. Bantering with you earlier made me very happy. Seeing flashes of your smile and happiness brings me more joy than I can express, she said kindly. The blonde's expression remained pained. There are just some things I can't tell you. Not now, he said rigidly. The heiress sighed and raised one of his hands up. She then gently kissed his bandaged palm. She then did the same for his other hand. I won't force you to tell me. Just understand that I wouldn't cut you off or push you away. You're precious and unique, Naruto-kun, she said tenderly. Naruto's face was practically glowing red by this point, and he clearly had no idea whatsoever how to respond to such open and sincere affection. I'll think about it. Not right now, though, he said hoarsely. Hinata nodded and let go of his hands. She then smiled once more. When you're ready, I'll listen to all you have to say. Till then, know that you don't need to be ashamed of yourself. I don't consider you to be less than anybody else. Quite the opposite, she said. Naruto swallowed a lump in his throat and glanced around at the flowers and plants. You said you liked to press flowers earlier. Could you show me what you mean by that? He requested in an attempt to change the subject. The heiress' smile brightened at the question. I would love to. Hinata smiled to herself as she put the finishing touches on the sketch. It had taken a fair amount of time to reach the point of near completion, but based upon what she was seeing now that she had opted to view the drawing broadly, the work would be worth it. I really should try drawing his whole form soon. As much as I like his face, there is more to him than that, she thought to herself. It was a bit past 11 o'clock, and Naruto had returned to his bedroom to sleep after a predictably stubborn breakfast. His resistances to her offerings of food each morning were growing less and less frivolous, but they were still present. It would take time, but progress was progress. In general, she was feeling optimistic regarding his state. The previous day had marked the most open she had ever seen him in recent times, and she had even managed to catch him smiling once or twice. It brought her great satisfaction and joy to see light returning to his eyes. It was also heartening to know that her father wasn't opposed to his presence. Kissing his hands may have been a bridge too far, but he didn't complain. Hinata thought to herself. The action itself had been fairly tame. A simple gesture of care, and one that was quite common only a few decades prior. But she knew all too well just how foreign such a thing was to Naruto. It was less a romantic gesture than a motherly one in context, but both intentions would be mostly unknown to the blonde in terms of personal experience. A thought then occurred to her. He's mostly unresponsive to words of encouragement. They clearly make him think, but they don't cheer him up, she pondered. Her face quickly gained a subtle degree of color at the notion of the solution she silently concocted within her mind. It isn't inappropriate, but how good an idea is it? He's so badly stunted emotionally, she debated silently. Shaking her head with a sigh and patting her cheeks to dispel the heat in them, Hinata returned her attention to her art. When you come out again, I'll see how I feel, she muttered to the still sleeping boy in the next room over. For the following 90 minutes, she imbued a level of detail into her sketch of Naruto that she had never previously attempted. It was an enthralling experience, as drawing him always tended to be for the heiress. Her artistic indulgence only ended when the sound of the bedroom door opening keyed itself into her eardrums. As expected, when she turned around in her chair to face the hallway, Her classmate stood just outside his bedroom with a tired look on his face. He was still in the very same pajamas he had been wearing upon his initial awakening earlier in the day, and his hair was equally as messy. Despite the lack of polish to his appearance, Hinata still found it to be endlessly endearing. At the sight of him, the heiress stood up and walked to the boy. "Good afternoon, Naruto-kun." She greeted him as he attempted to blink his eyes free of their heaviness. Though he began to respond, his words were interrupted by a yawn. The involuntary slip-up finally convinced Hinata to do what she had been considering beforehand. Ignoring her nerves, Hinata stepped forward and wrapped him up in a tight hug. "What are you?" Naruto started, trailing off as he was softly squeezed around the abdomen. The heiress peered up at him from under his chin and smiled jovially. "I'm glad you're awake again," she said kindly. Her classmate blinked several times with a puzzled look on his face, but he made no action to push her away. "It's only been a few hours, you know," he grumbled awkwardly. The heiress shrugged her shoulders and released him, but kept her hands on his shoulders. "Be that as it may, I'm still happy to see you again. You look well rested," she said. Naruto shrugged and rubbed his eyes wearily. "I'm still exhausted. I'm just coming out for water," he said. The Hyuga girl shook her head and steered him toward the table rather than the fridge, where she knew his supply of water bottles to be. "No, I think it's time that you eat lunch, Naruto-kun," she corrected him. The blonde scowled and gave her an irritated look. "I haven't been eating lunch up to now, and I'm fine," he argued pointlessly. Hinata simply shook her head and gently sat him into one of the chairs. "And you'll be even better once you start eating more than once per day. You're awfully underweight right now," she said. Naruto rolled his eyes and loosely leaned his cheek on his palm as the heiress produced pre-prepared food from the bag she always brought along with her. "You say that like you know what I should be weighing," he grumbled under his breath. His words coincided with Hinata turning around to bring the food she had readied for him. "Not down to the number, but I shouldn't be able to see the outlines of your cheekbones so easily, and your ribs shouldn't dig into my stomach when I hug you," she countered bluntly. Naruto glanced down at his abdomen and twitched subtly. "If you don't like feeling it, then don't hug me," he said quietly. The heiress' expression softened a bit as she set the food down in front of him. It was fried fish, which to her knowledge, he had never eaten before. "I didn't mean it that way. I just want you to be healthy. I can't have you starving on me," she said. Her classmate looked back up from the floor and eyed his food. Fully prepared to engage in one of the many games of back and forth they tended to play when it came to Naruto's meals, Hinata sighed and began to rise from her chair. Much to her surprise, he took a bite from his chopsticks without complaint. "You're still confusing to me," he said vaguely while he chewed the fish slowly so as to discern a concrete opinion on the new food. Hinata settled across the table from him and gave a quizzical look. "In what way?" "I've tried quite hard to be straightforward," she asked curiously. The blonde looked at her head on for the first time in several minutes and absently fiddled with his chopsticks. "That's what I mean. You're so much more talkative. You're actually, like, pushing me to do things. You barely had a personality back at school," he said. Hinata instantly felt her mood crash downward. She caught herself before it could become overwhelming, but it had damaged her spirits nonetheless. "I'm quite shy. I still am. Doing all of this for you has been a great help in that regard, but I still get nervous. I'm sorry to have been so bland before," she muttered dejectedly. In a flash of life quite foreign to his present state, Naruto immediately seemed to realize the impact his words had had on the girl. "I shouldn't have said it that way. I just meant that you were really quiet is all. Not everybody is as loud and obnoxious as me. Please don't feel bad," he said frantically. Hinata's darkened expression slowly gave way to a long gaze. "You never change, Naruto-kun. Even now, you're still the same," she said wistfully. The blonde frowned and made a failed attempt to decipher the meaning behind her words. "You hate it when other people are in pain. So much so that you immediately tear yourself down to make them feel better by comparison. I've seen you do it 1,000 times, even when all you get in return is a glare and an insult." Hinata continued when she realized that he was without a response. She then pursed her lips. "I really should have recognized it as a sign of how much you were hurting inside. I've never heard you say something nice about yourself. Even when you preach about wanting to become Hokage, it's always about others, not yourself, the Hyuga girl said. Naruto blankly took another bite of his fish. Yeah, so what? He shot back robotically. Her words had struck a chord, and she knew it. Not a particularly positive one, clearly, but it mattered little. He was now listening, even if he was far from joyful. You hate yourself, don't you, Naruto-kun? Hinata asked. It pained her immensely to even speak such words, but she knew all too well what could happen if she let any stones go unturned. For a time, Naruto did not respond. It was a predictable reaction. Admittance to self-loathing was no easy feat, especially to another person. At least somebody finally figured it out, he said numbly, standing up from the table and turning his attention toward the bedroom in the hallway. The heiress quickly scrambled to her feet and scurried in front of him to cut off his ability to shut himself away. Instead of simply trying to push her aside, Naruto turned around and made a short walk to the couch, which he laid down on with his face pressed into the cushion. Oh, Naruto-kun, Hinata whispered as she stared across the room at his motionless form. He was shutting himself down emotionally. She knew why, though the reason still disturbed her greatly. At least he isn't hurting himself. Yet, anyway, she thought to herself sadly. She then followed her immediate instinct and briskly made her way over to Naruto. At first, she simply stood over him. Please say something, she requested softly. In return, all she got was a slight curling of his posture. During the shift, she had briefly caught sight of his face. It bore a look of shame. At this, the heiress slowly inserted herself onto the small slice of remaining space on the edge of the couch. She then wrapped her arms around his midsection to anchor herself. Don't hate who you are. You of all people should be proud of yourself. Because who you are is beautiful. I'll say it as many times as I need to. I'll hug you as many times as I need to. I'll take as much time as I need to, she whispered in his ear as her chin rested on his shoulder from behind. Though he made no sounds, Hinata could feel him tense, and then shudder. His jaw was tightened and his body was shaking. Cry if you must. I'll stay right here. If you were worth hating, I wouldn't be here whispering to you right now. If you were anywhere near as disgusting as you clearly think you are, I'd have abandoned you on the first day. But you aren't disgusting or hateable, so here I am. Hinata tenderly expressed. Then, something odd happened. Over time, at a gradual pace, he relaxed completely and his breathing evened. He had fallen asleep. Be it from exhaustion or contentment, it brought the heiress great relief to know that he was at least resting. Consciousness would have only led to a prolonged mental torture. Alongside this relief came a new level of filtration to Hinata. Or rather, a lack thereof. And I do it all, because I love you. Naruto lay awake as he stared up at the ceiling of his small living room. For all that he had grounds to complain about regarding his living conditions, heating was luckily not one of them. In the dead of winter, with the temperature nearly reaching zero outside, his apartment remained serviceably warm. Air conditioning was another story entirely, but sweltering heat was far more survivable than bitter cold. Now, though, he wasn't thinking about the temperature. He was still laying on his couch, and had been since roughly noon that same day. It was now 11:30 at night, and Hinata had left roughly 2 hours beforehand. She had remained latched to his back for quite some time, given that she was still holding him when he awoke at 5 in the evening earlier in the day. She had eventually peeled herself off of him, but only to cover him with a blanket and sit quietly by his side near the couch for the final hour of her stay. Her commitment was completely unshakable, it seemed. Be it laying in silence for hours on end, practically force-feeding him in an effort to keep him healthy, or even taking the tedious steps to teach him how to press flowers, Hinata Hyuga never faltered. She possessed a bloody, single-minded determination to do what she deemed necessary to lift him up time and time again. It was puzzling. Because who you are is beautiful. Her words had grown more intensely positive and affectionate as time had gone on, and the longer they trended in that direction, the more deeply they cut into him. He still couldn't fully understand what they meant or why she insisted so fervently on saying them, but they elicited emotions in him that were entirely new. Slowly rolling into an upright posture, Naruto threw his feet over the side of the couch and sat up. Why are you so bent on breaking me open and making me talk? Why do you care if I hate myself or not? It doesn't affect you or your life if I do or don't. He questioned in his silence with his arms resting on his knees. A heavy sigh then dragged out of him. And why do you always do weird things like hugging me and holding me? Why won't you just come out and explain it all to me when I ask? He pondered. At the thought, the feeling of Hinata's arms locked around his upper stomach returned to him briefly. After a brief moment of processing, he found that now that he was without it, he greatly missed the sensation. How cute. You've been given your first taste of physical affection, and now you don't know what to do with yourself, came a dark voice. It was the last thing Naruto wanted to hear, but he had learned the hard way that he had no real control over when and where the grating tones of the ancient being would emerge. Off. The blonde growled to the voice. A sanguinary laugh shivered through Naruto's mind and body in response to his harsh retort. You aren't exactly eloquent, but your occasional flashes of vulgarity never cease to pleasantly surprise me. Maybe you do have a spine. The ancient being mocked sarcastically. Naruto focused himself on breathing evenly to calm his nerves. It's my body, my rules. You're stuck in that box. You're all talk. He hissed back. The boy's head then pulsated with dull pain, causing him to instantly clutch his temples. Am I really? The dark voice countered as the blonde's skull throbbed. Naruto bared his teeth in the dark and took in mediating breaths. A headache isn't going to break me, he said as firmly as he could. His defiance earned him another punishment in the form of his nails sharpening and lengthening. Due to his hands having been tightly gripping his own legs, his claws dug into his skin through his pants. Flinching at the pain, he quickly pulled his hands away from his body and stood up. Maybe not, but you can only endure for so long. Your choices are limited. You can either remain conscious and contend with this, or you can sleep and relive a few of my favorite memories of yours. Take your pick. The entity replied. Though he began to respond, Naruto thought better of it and instead made his way to his bathroom. After a painstakingly slow walk, he entered the room and shut the door behind him. He then went to work trying to clean the minor wounds on his legs. This is as much resistance as you've ever put up. Perhaps you've outgrown simple goading, the ancient voice said as the boy painfully rubbed his bloodied thigh with a wet towel. Naruto simply ignored him and continued to do as he had been doing. There was no point in engaging. It had never ended well before, and that dynamic hadn't changed one bit. Easily detecting this shift in approach, the dark entity went silent for a time. Though he remained apprehensive, Naruto allowed himself to relax somewhat as seeming solitude set in. Once he was satisfied with the state of the cuts on his legs, the blonde shut off the bathroom light and exited the room. He then made his way to the fridge, retrieving a bottle of water with great caution so as not to puncture it with his now serrated nails. With the water firmly in hand, he walked back to his bedroom and entered. He had spent less time in his bedroom that day than any other in the previous 30 days, though most of it had still been spent laying in inert stillness. He briefly tried to find ironic humor in that fact, but chose to keep his thinking to as low a level as was possible. Once he was settled on the mattress again, however, his least favorite voice chimed in one final time. I have a question for you, Naruto, the ancient being said vaguely. The blonde kept his silence defiantly. Chuckling a bit, the entity continued regardless. Would you like to know how your mother died?